Hello, everyone. This is Rafi, and I'm here with my friend Andrew Scarborough. How are you doing, man?
I'm really good, thanks. I had a walk this morning. I always have a 2 hour walk early in the morning after I wake up.
Oh, 2 hour walk. That sounds perfect.
Well,
Perfect way to start the day.
it's at least 2 hours because I
Wow.
find that it just sets me up well for the day.
Oh, I can believe that, and I hope to one day put as much time into walking as you do. I usually really make an effort to go walk whenever I have how could I put it? Not nothing better to do, because walking is a great thing to do. It's actually great to, whether it's just listening to nature or listening to a podcast or just moving. So I did that yesterday with my girlfriend. After about an hour after we worked out, we went for a walk. But starting the day with 2 hours just to walk, that sounds just perfect.
Well, the interesting thing for me is that I'm constantly managing this low level seizure activity. And when I wake up, my seizure threshold appears to be a bit lower. So then I go for these walks, and about half an hour in, I'm able to increase my seizure threshold to the point where I just feel normal, or as far as I
Yeah.
know, normal to be.
Hmm.
So that's one of my main methods of managing my seizure activity to some kind of normalcy. And
When you say feeling normal, what do you mean by that? Is it like an internal state? Is it something that you can feel very tangibly in terms of like more physical rather than mental, or what do you mean by normal there?
a bit of both. So I have a type of epilepsy called reflex epilepsy, and I have a number of things that trigger this kind of activity, which can be some tingling or strange sensations. Sometimes I feel like I'm floating. And if I go for a walk and I focus on my breathing, just in and out through my nose in a very controlled fashion, I'm able to bring that down. And interestingly, after I've gone for these long walks, I've often, mainly curiously, just measured my blood glucose and ketones, and I'm able to then get in that range that I've found correlates with optimal seizure activity control for me. And I just feel
Right.
very, I feel I have a lot more clarity and a lot more energy after that.
Yeah, there's so much to walking. In addition to the mechanics of it, there's the being outside.
Mm.
There's the difference in breathing than when you're just sitting, especially if, like me, you tend to slouch. There's just so many things going on in such a simple, I guess, intervention, if we want to medicalize it. But that's actually one of the things that I'm hoping to implement in this clinic I'm consulting with. We want to make that a prescription, just as the Japanese do with forest bathing. I think you've heard of that
Yeah.
probably. I just think that's such an advanced yet sort of primitive thing we can do for people. That's really effective for so many things. Like you said, it changes your mental moment to moment affect, as it does measurable biomarkers, and it's just walking.
Yeah, I'd note that it has massive benefits for me just cognitively and with my seizure activity. I always see the seizure activity as a blessing now because I have instant feedback on what I'm doing that could be beneficial or not for
Mhm.
other reasons, just general health and also cancer wise. Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's what I've found just over the years, and it's been um, coming up to 8 years now since my diagnosis of my malignant brain tumor and the subsequent damage that I got from the brain hemorrhage that caused me to discover that I had the tumor in the first place.
Hmm. Yeah, and actually, before you tell us more about where that sort of steered your life and your career and your medical interests, maybe because I didn't even do any job at all of introducing you, just said my friend Andrew.
We can add that later.
Maybe, yeah, maybe you can just give us just a few minutes about what happened and what that meant for your career and where you are now, and then we can go into what you're really interested in now and what you're writing about.
Well, it's been a long journey. I started as a personal trainer and nutritional therapist many years back now. And I was just suffering with these really bad migraines, and I never had migraines before. And they just progressively got worse and worse. At the time, I was also doing a master's in nutritional therapy. And I actually quit my job as a personal trainer to focus on that full time because I wanted to have an understanding of why I was suffering with these migraines. I thought it was related to my nutrition, but I was keeping to what I thought at the time was a perfect kind of diet. Is just very focused on lots of colorful fruits and vegetables and um, lots of foods that we thought at the time would be optimal for health. So I was still having no real success there with managing these symptoms, and they were getting worse up to the point where I suffered a brain hemorrhage on a train, and then was diagnosed with a high-grade glioma, and then I had an operation to remove most of it, and I had some treatment. The treatment was showing no sign of doing anything good, and I still had some signaling activity on the scans and still a kind of little area of what was thought to be disease. So I adopted a metabolic approach, and I had a lot of success with that, with managing the epilepsy, and then eventually the signaling activity was showing no signs on the scans, and on MR spectroscopy, which is a type of scan where you're able to see the bioenergetic demands of the tumor area, it was then showing no real activity. So I was then told I had no evidence of disease, and I was in complete remission, is what they called it. So my oncologist was very excited about that. And since then, I decided to go into cancer research, focusing on brain cancer and trying to find out as much as I could to see what more I could do to help other people and help myself. So that's where we are now.
And there was an article about you in the New Scientist, if I'm correct. Do you remember what year it was?
Yeah, 2016. So February 2016 that came out.
Right.
And the way that came about is I was actually I was at a networking event with New Scientist magazine, and I just got to talking with some of the people there, and they were just blown. It just came up casually that my story, and they were interested in what I had to say, and so I had one of the journalists was just following me around for a week and talking to my oncologist for quotes and to see if I was actually someone who had an interesting case or if I was just one of these cancer anecdotes that you hear on the internet.
Right.
And so when they realized that this was actually quite significant and it's not just some nutter who's come up to them and said these crazy things, they just were incredibly interested and wrote that piece. So
yeah, kudos to them, because like you say, a lot of people will just be very dismissive and not be able to do the journalistic work to distinguish anecdote from let's say interesting anecdotes. So yeah, kudos to them for that. And was the article written, did you like it? Is there anything you'd like changed? Or
it was very good because they did a lot of research into it and looked at my clinical notes and spoke to my oncologist in depth and made sure to get as much of the factual data as possible before coming up with anything. So I was really happy with how it was written.
Great, that's good. That's a positive experience with media for once.
Well, I think New Scientists are quite good. I don't really like the direction they've taken more recently, because they're talking a lot. They're writing a lot about identity politics, which I don't think is
Right.
something that should be
That
uh,
scourge.
written about in a scientific
Yeah.
magazine. Just a lot of stuff about non-binary and transgender and Black Lives Matter. I don't think that should be in a scientific magazine. I think they should stay away from that stuff
Yeah.
personally, but that's just my view.
No, I share it. I think there are social sciences and political commentary venues that are more appropriate for the sort of ideas and their ability to be verified, shall we say? And yeah, personally, I think this identitarian game that's being played is pitting people one against the other, and that it stops people from understanding one another, which is the goal of anyone who would be against racism. When you know someone, when you can learn about them, you can appropriate some of their culture, which is a wonderful thing, actually, to appropriate other people's culture for everyone's benefit, not just your own. So I encourage the sharing in that aspect.
Well, you can ask who really owns culture. Can you own culture?
Right.
And if you can appreciate culture, you're not necessarily appropriating what belongs to someone else. It doesn't really belong to anyone, I'd say. And I'd say
Yeah,
that as
that's, yeah.
I'd say that as someone who has mixed race background. So, you know, culture and race are two completely different things.
Yeah. Yeah, that means you'd be internally conflicted just by being a mixed background person, which is absurd, really.
And it allows you to have views on everything and nothing at all, apparently.
Yeah. True. Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned this life-changing event that you managed to navigate, I would say, exceptionally, because I think people fail to appreciate often what it means to feel like the decisions you're going to make about scientific evidence and personal experience is potentially a life or death situation, and to be able to stick to what you believe is the best evidence for years on end and keep that going and work with, you have to work with your primary care doctor, you have to navigate maybe professional or even familial situations where those questions become relevant. And I think a lot of people who are very critical of these, quote, cancer anecdotes really fail to appreciate what it means to have the courage and the ability to take those decisions, I would say, independently, because there's something comforting in putting everything on the doctor's shoulders, and that's actually not their role. They're advisors. They are not the king of your decision-making kingdom.
Yeah, well, I think I was lucky that I had this background in nutritional therapy. But even then, it's not something that's really accepted in that field of oncology, just that someone is thinking about a particular diet to manage their whatever it is, not necessarily cancer, but that's the main one that has this major resistance. And I would say with the anecdotes, it's very important that we are critical of these anecdotes, because there's so much rubbish on the internet. There are so many people who've claimed all these what looks like incredible results, whereby they say, I've completely eradicated my disease from taking cannabis oil or doing all these things. And the problem is there might be some merit to what they're saying if you're looking at the theoretical underpinnings behind these certain agents like the cannabis oil and other things they might be doing. However, when you look into more detail about their situation, or in terms of their type of cancer, or how they're communicating what they're doing, you find holes in what they're saying, and the things that aren't completely accurate. Sometimes people will get the course of their cancer wrong in terms of what it actually is, or they'll use, I've seen MRI scans where it's a completely different sequence of images, but someone who's not educated enough won't be able to see that. To me, it's immediately obvious, but I can tell the difference between different sequences on a brain MRI, on a head MRI scan, and
Right, and
someone
it's not
else might not.
intuitive at all.
Yeah, and it's obvious if you know what to look for. So I think it's always important to question these stories. You have to have as much evidence as you can give in terms of that, and even just the histopathology report. I think all patients should have access to that and should have even like a printout so that they can look at it and interpret it themselves, because I know for brain cancer there's specific mutations that are routinely looked at, but then there are these other mutations that could be very beneficial to know.
Right. Yeah. And this decision making with regards to your personal health, you're still having to contend with, because you do follow up scans, as I understand it. And right, it's
Yeah,
the
it's
the gadolinium agent that's used in those scans.
It is, but I haven't had that for a few years now, because I just know
Okay.
I've educated myself about the dangers, about the dangers of that. If you're continually having that injected into you every time you have a scan, it accumulates in specific regions of the brain and tissues around the body. And we used to think it was safe. For many years, it was deemed completely safe in both its linear and macrocyclic forms. So the more stable gadolinium agents were thought to be completely excreted by the body, but over a 24-hour period. But we know now that that's not the case, and we know that it can cause significant damage even in patients with healthy kidney function. And that's something that I'm looking at a lot at the moment, writing an ebook on it. I'm thinking of even not having I'm thinking of having the ebook not on Amazon as well, because I don't want them to take any money from it. I want it to go. I want most of the money from the ebook to go to research into gadolinium. It's called gadolinium deposition disease, but it's something that you would only know that you had it if you would only know if you had it if you were tested, and it's not routinely tested for. So there's millions of people who could be walking around with this that don't know it, and they might be associating their symptoms with the condition they're monitoring. So that's a major issue as well. Just I get people who tell me,
go ahead.
I get people who tell me, oh, I've had countless MRI scans with gadolinium and I'm fine, so you're just scaremongering. But then I say, well, have you had a test for retention? And then they tell me, oh no, but I don't need to because I'm fine. And then I'll see that they're complaining about certain symptoms that are associated with gadolinium toxicity, but then they're putting it down to just whatever condition they're dealing with. And that's a huge it's a frustration for me. But
so how do you test for retention?
You can either have a blood or a urine test. I would advocate for both. And another thing you can do actually, which is quite concerning in a way, is you could have had many scans with the gadolinium based contrast. And then if you have another scan after that, even a few days or weeks after, without gadolinium, you can actually see that it's still illuminated the areas in the brain. So
I see.
it's still there. It's still in those regions in the brain, and it has been shown to accumulate in brain tumors via autopsy. So yeah, that's another test that you could do, and it's quite concerning because it's still able to. That's what it does. It's this.
Mhm.
It has these strong paramagnetic properties that allows you to visualize these areas of the mainly the vasculature. It enables you to visualize the areas of disease and the blood flow.
Okay.
So it's very good at doing that, but it's overused and overvalued. You don't necessarily need to use it for looking at what you want to see. That's why I never
So,
have it
so
in.
what would be the scenario where you think it would be useful and worth it,
Well, in
if there
Germany,
is one?
they're discussing this a lot because they're a lot of the research on gadolinium retention is coming out of Germany because there's been this massive movement um, in the country of patients standing up and saying that this is a problem, and so they've even thought about this idea of a health passport. It's not like a COVID thing, but a health passport to show how many scans with gadolinium you've had and to try and lessen that. So to try and reduce the exposure to the contrast agent as much as possible.
Just like
And
we have for X-rays, right? If you were there, I think there are some conditions where you'd be monitored for how many X-rays you've required.
yeah, so that it's never been seen as a problem with these MRI scans because obviously MRI scans are non-ionizing radiation. But the problem is with the contrast agent, and that's a silent problem. No one's really talking about it. It's just these patients or these researchers who aren't they're not in touch with patients. So it's mainly just other academics who are looking at this work, showing that it's not necessarily safe anymore. Even the radiographers I've spoken to about this aren't aware of the more recent studies showing that we need to be careful about this.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, as you were explaining, many different conditions can be investigated using this contrast agent and an MRI. So it's potentially, even if it's a small percent, even if it's 1% of people who have these contrasts injected into them, it's still of massive, massive importance if we can detect, if we can definitely detect a negative effect. And of course, for that, we need randomization, we need prospective sort of studies, but it seems really, really feasible. I mean, people are already getting those scans. There's no ethical problem because the ethics are already set up so that you can inject this into people and it's already accepted. So you wouldn't have to, it's very testable. So I hope people do that, even if they're very skeptical, because it's easy to avoid.
Yeah, I would definitely advocate for more routine testing and also using it using it only when you absolutely have to have it. There's some fantastic research from the US. I interviewed Dr. Brent Wagner on my podcast. Give it a plug, why not?
Yeah.
And he's the world's leading researcher on gadolinium retention and toxicity. And he's about to do. He's about to look at this in actual human patients rather than just the cell models that he uses and the animals. He's looking at he wants to have a number of patients that he's closely monitoring and assessing them for retention and what physiological effects this rare earth metal is having, because we don't we still don't know all of the effects. And this use of these agents has only been it's only been in clinical use over the past coming up to 30 years, I think it is. And so because the damage is, because the effect is cumulative and damage it will be accumulating over time, the more scans you have over the more years, that's when you would expect to see more of these issues relating to toxicity. It's only taken to this point where we've seen those effects. There haven't been any clinical trials, as you touched on earlier, showing this, because it can take so many years to see long-term effects. It's one of the reasons I'm very cautious about these COVID vaccines, actually, just the long-term effects that we might see. So it's the same thing with gadolinium. We've only seen the effects many years later with some people. There are others who do get this acute response almost immediately after having the dye. And they're termed as just having this very rare allergic response. And it's not really, I don't like calling it an allergy, because it's something that if the bound gadolinium is then free and is causing you this toxicity, it would have that response in anybody. You know, it's not, it's a highly toxic rare earth metal. It's not supposed to be in the body, and if it is in that in that fashion, then anyone's going to have this response. In these acute situations, it's termed nephrogenic systemic fibrosis. Okay. And even with that, it used to be seen that was only with the less stable agents, and it was only in patients who had impaired renal function. But this is not the case. We know right. From further studies that this is an issue for everyone having these scans, and nobody's really aware of it.
Yeah. Well, I think it's great that you're bringing attention to it, and hopefully maybe your information is going to leak out to patients and help them at least understand the potential risks that are there, to then make their own decision and maybe moderate the number of scans they do, or see if there's something else that they could be looking at to assess progress or something else. So because as you said, I think it's not always necessarily used in the appropriate situation, even if it is non-toxic.
Yeah, and Dr. Wagner is looking at gadolinium in the fingernails of patients, as well as just the hair, and just collecting so much data on this and showing the physiological effects in his research that is really highlighting the issue. And he's very responsive to patients who are contacting him. And he's just doing incredible work. So I thought I'd highlight that. I think what definitely. He's doing is really incredible, because you have all these self-interested companies. This makes a lot of money, you know. And he's giving speeches at he's giving presentations at these conferences for these pharmaceutical companies, and at with the FDA, and I can imagine he maybe gets some backlash or some unwelcome responses, but he's you can't argue with what he's discovered and how he's done it. It's in a very unbiased way, and it's very revealing. So we definitely need to do something about it.
Yeah, definitely. And you brought up the COVID vaccines, and I like to return to them because they're a really interesting topic in which to discuss risk. Because there is risk in any intervention. Most, I would say 99% of the time, you know, it's rarely totally negligible. And the question of the COVID vaccine is very interesting, because I've had discussions with friends who have a relative who have lupus maybe, or some other autoimmune or overactive immune system condition. And the question of whether or not these people should be given a nanolipid particle delivered vaccine is really, really difficult to answer. I don't think anyone knows. I think we have some good ideas of how we can sort of lay out the landscape of risk. So, for example, my parents who are 73 and 68 have gotten COVID and are fine. But I would not recommend that they now take any vaccine, because I have much more empirical evidence that coronaviruses induce lasting immunity. And I think we've got that data for 17 years now with SARS-1, and 7 months of data with SARS-CoV-2. That's pretty good in my book, as a Bayesian prior, if you will, when you're assessing your risk there. So to my mind, if you've already had it, which I think you have, Andrew, you mentioned that. I've already had it,
I think so.
Yeah. Right. Because you were measured by PCR, right?
Yeah, and I know it has some degree of false positives, so I'm not really sure, but I did have mild symptoms, and I did have all of the main symptoms that you're supposed to get. So I don't know. I think I had it, but
yeah, I would bet that you did. If those symptoms were close and your PCR was positive, I'd bet you did have it, indeed. Now, you were saying, and maybe you can just give us the background here, but there's a lot of pressure in the UK for people who work in healthcare to take the vaccine. So how has your experience been within that setting?
Yeah, there's massive pressure, and I'm potentially restricted in what I'm able to do because of that. So if I have the vaccine, I'm able to have more face-to-face interaction with patients, even though supposedly it wouldn't stop me from transmitting it. So I don't really understand why that is. Well, that's the theory, that it's not really likely to prevent transmission or to stop you getting it. But just less symptoms.
I don't know about you, but I think people are trying to have it both ways in this question, because on the one hand, it's totally irresponsible not to get vaccinated, as some people will argue. And on the other hand, it's going to make absolutely no difference for transmission, and you can't go hug grandma. So why is it so important if it doesn't change the only thing you really care about, which is being able to mingle without putting people at risk? There's such a disconnect in my mind with both of those beliefs.
Well, my only concern was, I agree with you for one, but my only concern was that it might trigger my epilepsy if I got it. And then supposedly I have had it. I feel like I've had it. And it didn't cause my epilepsy to become more serious than just a few partial seizures, only affecting a small area of my brain, making me feel a bit strange, like I was on a boat. That's the only thing I experienced. So I wouldn't be afraid of getting it again, even if I did. The only thing is, if I got it again and supposedly it could be more severe, that's the kind of that's what I'm told could happen, which is one of the reasons I've been pressured, I'd say, into taking the vaccine. I had a long conversation with my neurologist about this, because it can provoke seizures having the vaccines, particularly the mRNA vaccines, because they have not because of their unique mechanism of action, although that may be of concern, but because of the ingredients. I'm trying to remember what the ingredient was now. I mentioned it
polyethylene glycol.
Yeah, polyethylene glycol. one of the main ingredients that's been linked to these allergic reactions to the vaccine, which I don't even feel comfortable calling it a vaccine, because it's not really, in the way it functions, isn't really like a traditional vaccine.
Right, it is really quite different, and excitingly so. But that comes with a lot of caution. And at this point, I like to bring up my friend Gabor's list of vaccine criteria for which he'd be more comfortable taking it, assuming he hadn't already had it. What would those criteria be to make him feel more comfortable? So he mentions, selecting multiple antigens that stimulate neutralizing antibodies, because not all antigens do this. So having a more selective vaccine is definitely possible in principle. So I think that's not an unreasonable request, since this is, again, extremely novel. I mean, it's hard to overstate how novel a technology, and actually we are running an experiment on the population. Whether it's justified or not is separate, but we are running an experiment. That's clear. The other one is the TLR4 binding sites. I think it's these very new vaccines delivered via nanoparticle have TLR4 binding sites, which are potentially triggering of strong immune responses. And especially the SEB motif, which is the staphylococcal enterotoxin B motif, which is what our bodies recognize when we get infected with a certain bacteria that can be very, very, very deadly, especially in weak people in a hospital setting, or with people with hyper-stimulable immune systems. And then, the level of mimicry with humans between the virus and the human. Maybe there are some improvements that could be made there. And then just to finish it off, as you mentioned, polyethylene glycol or other adjuvant or autoimmune triggering compounds. I don't think we can take any of this for granted. So I think these are very specific reasons. I think you can debate them individually, of course, and say they're more or less relevant. But at this stage, given the little empirical basis that we have for it, that it's been developed, we've jumped a lot of safety assessment steps. I think people are not aware of this, but they have been. It's not like we went through them fast. They have not taken place, which is very different. So my general recommendation is, if you've already had it, I would not take it, irrespective of who you are. Now, if you haven't, then it becomes more complicated, and there's a more complex risk-benefit ratio to assess in individual cases. But yeah, in your case, the epilepsy, and in the fact that you have to consider the implication for your job, I think it puts you in a very, very difficult position. And I wish the conversation were less just a burning shit show of opinions about it, because it's actually difficult to decide what to do here.
It's very difficult, because I've been called an anti-vaxxer and all this. Just having reasoned just conversations about this. Just not, yeah, I don't have any extreme views. I'm not anti-vax. I'm just, I don't think it's necessary to have a vaccine for something that isn't going to kill me, or, it's not like the plague. No. And one thing I would think is, I don't know the long-term effects of having had it, but then I also don't know the long-term effects of having a vaccine that I might not necessarily need. So it's an interesting one. The other thing I find interesting is actually that this mRNA technology is due to be used in vaccines for cancer. So it could have a benefit there, but in that instance, I would be more open to accepting it, because you have certain cancers where you don't really have a choice, and it's better to do something than nothing when the other options available aren't suggestive of any real benefit. So yeah, in that instance, I would say it's justifiable, but in this, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, it's difficult. I'm just thankful to not be of an age where it's even more pressing for me. But of course, my parents are, and other people in my family are of an age where it becomes, quite difficult to know what they should do. But yeah, it's just very disappointing to hear a lot of researchers that I can be in the same lab with or speak with on Twitter who have no confidence whatsoever in natural immunity. It's just astounding to me that we're there, and people who really should know better, who have a responsibility to be like, wait, someone's telling me that natural immunity won't help me against this. Wow, that's overturning the several decades of immunology. What's the evidence basis for this? Can I look it up? Can someone substantiate these claims? And people are just so nonchalant about, yeah, we don't know, you should get vaccinated anyway. I'm like, that's crazy. That's totally a responsible approach.
Yeah, as someone who's looked a lot at risk benefit with my own situation over the years, I know that that's maybe not the best approach to just say, oh, I'm just going to go for this, without looking at the possible consequences.
Yeah.
That was the whole thing with the gadolinium. I weighed the risks and the benefits, and I thought, well, I don't necessarily need this, and it could be causing me untold problems down the line. So I'm just not going to have it. And then I spoke to my oncologist about that, and he, to my surprise, was saying, yeah, you don't need this. Yeah, I know he knew that it could have these dangers associated with it. So I was very kind of shocked and surprised. I said, well, why have I been having it anyway? And then he just said, oh, it's just routine. It's what we do. But yeah.
Yeah, we've always done it this way, so that's what we're going to do. Is such a, it's interesting because I don't know if you've ever heard of Chesterton's fence, where there's this fence in the middle of the field, no one knows why it's there, and the question is, do you remove it or not? And the idea is that you shouldn't until you know what it's there for. Yet in medicine, it's kind of different because we use this thing called the burden of proof. And we're always trying to minimize our interventions because we know the potential harm that they can bring. So in fact, if you don't know why you're using something and there's no strong evidence of whether it's beneficial or not, you probably shouldn't be doing it until you can find some sort of evidence for it. So it's interesting how the Chesterton's fence thing comes to play into the medical context.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And just sometimes you only know. Sometimes you only know the benefit of something when you, or the detriment of having something when you take it away. And in this case, it's something that you're adding. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
there's no control groups where you're looking at immunity from having had COVID to immunity from having the vaccines. There's suggestions that having had it is more beneficial than having had the vaccines.
Yeah, absolutely. That'll be really interesting to see, by the way, down the road. There's another topic I wanted to bring up, and that's cannabis, because it's something, because you brought it up in an example before, how this cannabis oil has all sorts of claims to fame in cancer therapy for patients. So what's been your experience with the cannabis and cannabis for medical purposes in particular?
Well, I've had long discussions with Dr. Wei Liu, who is the main researcher on this at St. George's University Hospital. And we had discussions on how beneficial it might be and for different types of cancers, because the CBD receptors are expressed differently in different types of, not just different types of brain tumors, but different types of cancer. And I know that in breast cancer, it can antagonize antagonize some of the chemotherapeutic agents. So it may not be beneficial in that situation, but you do have to be mindful of what you're taking it with, and even just the fatty acid profile. It can alter that, and it can have some liver toxicity as well. So you have there's a lot to be mindful of, not just if it works or if it doesn't. And I've done a few experiments on my epilepsy with pure CBD, and a combination of THC and CBD, or a ratio that's I tried a 1-to-1 ratio, and then I tried a 2-to-1 and a 3-to-1 in favor of THC, and it actually made my seizure activity worse. So I went back to having Boswellic acids, because that's been the main thing that's allowed me to control my seizure activity when I experience this kind of these kind of sensations, and when I get this kind of aura that's suggestive that I may have been I may go on to have a more serious seizure. So I've taken that under the tongue, and then it's resolved this hyperactivity quite quite dramatically, and I'm always amazed at how effective that is. But yeah, that's I think the Boswellic acids actually are a different type of cannabinoid. So that's interesting in itself. Just that when we think about cannabis, we just think of a couple of cannabinoids, but there are so many in different things, not just the cannabis plants.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I probably have benefited from cannabinoids, but not necessarily in the forms that we like to recognize.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very important point, because, cannabis really is a pharmacopoeia of different compounds that have, so, I mean, they're just not tested. We've really not done the grunt work to separate them out. There's CBN now that's being sold as separate products in cannabis markets, CBG. There's a lot of combinations we haven't tried. And I actually think, maybe somewhat paradoxically, is if we can identify, like in your case, that THC, or maybe an excess of THC, if we're looking at it in terms of the ratio with CBD, which has some antagonism there, maybe that's inducing some seizure activity. It's not crazy to think there's an opposing cannabinoid in that mix that might actually do the opposite. So yeah, there's a lot that remains to be tested, but it can be very stimulating. So it's not all that surprising that it could trigger seizure activity.
And you can activate the endocannabinoid system by different means. It doesn't necessarily have to be ingesting cannabis oil.
Yeah, absolutely. You can affect the signaling of 2-AG and anandamide by your linoleic acid intake in your diet. I mean, those can change. And I would mention as well that there's been some interesting things with regards to cannabis activity for certain seizures, especially in children with refractory epilepsy. CBD seems to be a crucial component to minimize whatever those types of seizures are. And I admit I actually don't know the specifics. That was given to these children. The Charlotte's Web strain, CBD only strain, was given, and some kids respond to a mix of THC and CBD. So I think there's really a lot that we need to look into, and like you said, look into boswellic acids and different classes of cannabinoids.
Yeah, definitely. The boswellic acids have been a huge benefit to me. Initially, I took them to combat the brain swelling that I had after my brain hemorrhage, because I was taking dexamethasone for a few days, and just I knew how horrible that was. So in terms of potentially provoking some kind of progression of my cancer, and also just the range of other negative effects it has, and the anti-ketogenic effects. So I came off of that as soon as I could, and just replaced it with these boswellic acids in the form of Boswellia serrata, and the other boswellic acids in the form of a very pure oil.
And do you know what the mechanism of action might be for boswellic acids on seizure activity?
Well, it inhibits an enzyme involved in arachidonic acid, formation, that kind of
Oh, okay.
yeah. So it has this kind of
Interesting.
antithrombotic and just anti-inflammatory, a host of anti-inflammatory effects on the brain.
So would you speculate that it's improving vascular blood flow in certain parts of the brain? Do you think that might be how it's affecting that?
I think that's one of the mechanisms. Yeah, I think that's one thing it's doing. But
All
I think
right,
it's
that's
doing other
interesting.
things as well.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it
And I
probably has
think
some pleiotropic effects.
I think it's also improving the one thing that I think is hugely important, the omega-3 and 6 ratio in the brain, because we know that with these brain tumors, there's this massive imbalance where in and around the tumor area, you're having much higher amounts of arachidonic acid and very low amounts of DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, you managed to
that's
say
another
that.
thing I try
Good
to
on you.
optimize. Well, it
Yeah.
just, I find that fascinating, just how I think you can readdress that balance through diet and things that you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So talking about diet, that'll be my last question. We can spend a little bit of time on. So, what does your diet look like nowadays? And maybe before that, you want to tell us just what does the timeline look like? How did it evolve since you had this life-changing medical issue?
Well, when I was first diagnosed, I was transitioning onto a ketogenic diet. I went on a 4-to-1 ketogenic diet because I was trying to manage my epilepsy, and that's what I saw as the best way to do that from the research. I failed miserably, and I failed miserably because I found I was reacting to certain normal, very ketogenic foods, such as avocados, even coconut oil, and mainly plant foods. So I did an elimination diet. I was looked at the literature on this, and I found that there's such a thing as an oligoantigenic ketogenic diet, where it's basically just an elimination diet. And I also found that in certain types of epilepsy, you don't even necessarily have to be on a ketogenic diet. Sometimes you can just eliminate certain foods or certain things like wheat and gluten, and suddenly these children no longer have epilepsy. So it's this allergic reaction to certain foods that's actually triggering their seizures. And so I experimented with that just by eliminating certain foods. I was staying ketogenic because I thought that would be a good thing to do. But I was eliminating a lot of different foods and keeping a very detailed diary of my experiences, my food, mood, and symptom. Just keeping a log of my food, my mood, and my symptoms. And I found that there were certain trends that I could effectively control my seizure with, not only diet but other things. But the main things I noticed was that when I eliminated all plant matter from my diet, I had a huge benefit whereby I wasn't experiencing any seizure activity. And I thought, this is
Wow.
is a revelation. This is amazing. But then at the same time, I was thinking, well, surely this can't be healthy because I'm not having any fiber in my diet, and it's very difficult to get optimal nutrition doing this. I was thinking about nutrient density and just the fact that a 4-to-1 ketogenic diet, you're not having much protein, and if I'm only having meat and fish, it's very difficult to get the nutrients that I need. So I added insects and organ meats to that, because my rationale for that was that I know that I like to know where my food is coming from. So I bred the insects, which is a very strange thing for me to do, but after reading Weston A. Price's findings and a number of articles from anthropologists on just traditional diets, let's say, and ancestral nutritional practices, I found that I could actually do this quite easily by just adding a variety of organ meats and these insects, because entomophagy played a huge role in how we evolved, and you can manipulate their feed very easily to the requirements that you require.
So, are
I
you
started.
referring to their omega-3 levels, for example, depending on if you can feed them maybe some linseed that has some ALA or something?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, cool. That's really
Yeah,
cool.
well, I focus primarily on eating waxworms because they're very ketogenic,
Right.
and also waxworms are called waxworms because they live in beehives and they feed off of the wax. So
Gotcha.
I just thought I would feed them. I'd feed them lots of organic local honey and oats because they like that.
Nice.
But
Do
then
you know if they're very
I had
saturated
the
or?
yeah. Well, I did look at the fatty acid profile, and
Hmm.
it's pretty good. It is a mixture. I think it's more monounsaturated fats.
Right.
But yeah, it's just I focused on these fatty insects and tried to fatten them up as much as I could. And I thought I had this idea that if I give them honey, honey has all these benefits, but obviously would spike your blood sugar. So I thought that these waxworms eating the honey would take on those benefits and then allow me to have a food source which was just high in protein and fat. But then, yeah, I don't know in practice if that. I guess just you'd think it would have that benefit. So, yeah, and then I thought about, well, maybe I could feed them things like I could feed them cannabis plants and I don't know, all these other things,
Yeah.
seeing if they could what would happen to them. But
Yeah. Well,
I'm
we know
actually
that bears will when they're eating berries, their flesh will change. Will take on a slight bluish hue, and you can definitely taste what the vegetation they've been eating. So this is not some woo-woo transcendental thingy-majig. This is actually like it's potentially quite true and interesting.
yeah, and we do know that, for example, grass-fed meat is better than grain-fed, and just that how an animal eats definitely dictates how healthy the meat is going to be for you.
Yeah, I think
some argue
yeah.
with that. I don't know how, but they do.
Well, it depends what specifically you're talking about, because there are some meats, just like you can look at chicken, and they've been genetically bred to be so full of water that you really are diluting whatever nutrients are in there. So they're genuinely nutritionally very different. If you're talking about beef, and only the omega-6 to 3 ratio, well, yes, it has less omega-3, but the absolute amount is actually very small compared to what you could get with just literally a mouthful of salmon. And the omega-6 level really isn't that high in beef specifically to matter. In pork, you could argue differently, that they can accumulate more omega-6. So it's one of those things where I never get how people are so all or nothing on it, because it kind of depends of the animal and what they're feeding and how their metabolism is able to transform or maybe translate, what they're eating.
Yeah, I think pork is an interesting one, because I definitely don't do well with pork.
Mm.
And
What kind of symptoms do you get?
Well, it's mainly the seizure activity. Just I get this instant response, and also I don't feel satiated eating it. So it's just like I could continue to eat more and more, which is I just don't feel good. I don't feel good having it, so I avoid it. But I do have wild boar. I do enjoy that.
Oh yeah, I've had a wild boar that was hunted right around the mountain house my family has, and it was just this very dark meat with a big slab of fat on the top of it. And boar are quite lean actually overall, but
Yeah.
depending on the one you get and the piece of meat you get, it was just fantastic. It's really fantastic.
My dad lives in an area of Germany that has lots of wild boar just in the back
Right.
part of his garden. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I've had some boar from there. It's really good. And
So your typical diet, just if I have it right in my mind now, is like meat, fish, and insects. And what would be the proportion of that approximately?
well, at the moment, my diet's very different. It's interesting how I've over time the sensitivities that I've had to those plant foods have almost completely gone. So
Oh, interesting.
I can be a lot more relaxed in how I'm eating. So
That's
it's
great.
very very different to what it was. But
Right.
um, I still have these days where I just eat meat, fish, eggs.
Yeah.
um, Either because I'm lazy or because my seizure threshold has become a bit lower, so I just revert to that way of eating. But I am a lot less reactive to certain
Hmm.
foods that I couldn't eat before. And I'm interestingly, my levels of blood ketones and blood glucose that I was using to manage my epilepsy before have gone down a bit. So my actual that zone, that optimal zone for me doesn't need to be as high as it used to be.
Wow.
Um,
Excellent. So you're literally more resilient.
yeah, that's the theory.
Yeah.
That's
I
what I'm
think
guessing.
that's. I think immunologically or immunometabolically, we might say, given the evidence you have from the ketones, that's fascinating. That over time, the elimination and what some sort of repair or re-parametrizing that's going on just allows you to gain that margin that
Mm.
most of us are supposed to have that we often lost for one reason or another. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a gut thing or a brain thing or both.
Hmm.
Because on my scans there has been some resolution of the brain damage that I sustained. So the scar tissue has healed a bit, which
Hmm.
has maybe brought about those changes in the sensitivity. And
Yeah.
I do think that sometimes it's a bit like a muscle. You can train yourself to be more resilient, and in this case, it's training myself to have more resilience to my um, seizures that I was experiencing. Um, I noticed that massively when I had hyperbaric oxygen therapy,
Hmm.
because when I first went into the chamber, it provoked quite a bad seizure, and I was even having conversations with the people running the center that maybe I shouldn't keep doing this, because the idea was to go into deeper and deeper pressures in the chamber, which would
Hmm.
have provoked this activity further. Um, However, I presented to them some research that I found on the Marines who were using this air brake technique to effectively increase their seizure threshold when they're doing these deep dives, because everyone has a seizure threshold. If you push your brain hard enough,
Hmm.
if you accumulate those reactive oxygen species. um, so I was able to effectively train myself to tolerate more extreme pressures in the chamber, delivering that 100% oxygen. And all I did was just take off the mask and focus on my breathing, take some magnesium, which depresses that central nervous system hyperactivity, that kind of response. So I was able to effectively quell that, yet also still exposing myself to that stimulus from the oxygen to train myself, kind of like you do with progressive resistance exercises, to then be able to tolerate quite extreme pressures in the chamber. And
that's
I found
fascinating.
that,
That's
I found that
really
interesting.
that's a great demonstration of hormesis, because it's just such a overused, overhyped term, but this is a great example of hormesis in action, where you have this very clear, return, like, yeah, this is too much in one go, and that then if you try again, there's this adaptation and progressive overload, I guess, of reactive oxygen species is not only true at the muscular level for some adaptations, but seems to be true for the seizure threshold as well. That's really interesting. And yeah, congrats again for figuring that out, because that's not easy. So yeah, I mean, that's just fascinating. And thanks for taking the time to...
I could actually feel it in that part of my brain where the tumor was.
Oh, really?
I had a kind of a pressure in the... which is a strange sensation. It felt like something was in there.
Yeah, I can only imagine, like something just shot up into your brain. Wow. Well, Andrew, thanks so much for taking the time. This has been a treat for me, and it's been too long since we hadn't chatted properly.
Oh, definitely. Well, thanks for having me on, and it's great to catch up. I'm starting a new insect farm tomorrow, so...
Nice. Please send pictures.
Keep you updated. I will. I'll put it on my YouTube channel, because people have asked me to do this for years.
Nice. What's your YouTube channel?
It's just my name, so it should come up. There's an actor who has the same name as me, but it seems to come up with me more often than him. So I don't know how he feels about that. But.
Cool. And your Twitter handle is ASCarbs.
And I have my podcast as well.
Yeah, so Andrew Scarborough on YouTube and the Twitter handle.
And my podcast, The Human Guinea Pig Project.
The Human Guinea Pig Project. Okay, so check that out, everyone. Thanks, Andrew. Talk to you soon.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Bye.